Isn't it weird though that we're all born with a grenade in our tummies?
What the hell? I also thought that once you're like 37, it's a non-starter. It's done. I'm never gonna have to talk about it again. But
I think it
my
can come out any
bedmate,
time. Yeah.
apparently, it can happen anytime. My bedmate he was 93 and he got his appendix out too. Twinsies,
Oh,
a little grenade bomb. It was so weird. And now I get to hear everybody else's appendix stories, which is very fun.
It's
I
a
don't
weird
have
club
one
you're in.
yet.
I'm in the club.
It's a unique
Yeah.
identity you have.
It did have me thinking about the identity topic. Welcome to No Clear Answers, where we explore the common challenges all humans, creators, and leaders face and break down preconceived notions of common self help ideas. We are your hosts. I am Ricky Goldenberg.
I am Justin Mulvaney.
And I'm Dr. Corey Wilkes. Today, my voice cracks. Today, we're talking about identity. What it is, how it develops, how it gets in our way, what to do about it. So first off, as we usually do with the show, I want to kind of start with defining identity. So when you all talk about identity, or you just think about identity development itself, how do you define identity?
Can I ask a question to
You
start
just
with us?
did,
Because I was
but you
thinking
can
about
ask
this
another.
today. I was thinking about it a lot. I was thinking about it as like identity. I want to know in this group specifically, I see it as like it could fall within three different layers, and I'm curious which one resonates the most with you. Do you see identity as like our clothes, easily changed, easily purchased, easily switched? Do you see it as like our body, which is something that can be changed with, exercise and diet and some medical interventions, and you can actually make quite a lot of changes with it. It just takes a while for other people to see those changes. Or is it like your bones, like incredibly difficult to change, grows with you over time? I sort of saw it as three levels, and I'm curious where we all vibe on that.
Depends on the identity, I would say.
That's why we're
Oh, you
opening with
think
this
identity
question.
falls across all three spectrums? There's some that are bones, some that are body, and some that are clothes?
Yeah,
Maybe.
Corey, you want to take the first shot, or I have multiple
Go
thoughts?
ahead.
This is a great.
I'm just saying maybe. Maybe
Maybe.
that's why we're discussing it.
I think I'll give a definition and then I'll play off of you, Ricky. The simplest way, because identity you can get really deep and esoteric and philosophical and conceptual. The clearest way I could think of it is it's anything we think about ourselves. It's any way that you think about yourself, you conceptualize yourself. And so identity can be I want to avoid the like grenade of like gender and sexuality and things like that. But even that in some sense is a way that you conceptualize and think of yourself. You can think of yourselves in terms of your roles. You can think of yourself as a fit person, an unhealthy person, a this, a that, a there. You can think of yourself as a good person, a bad person. But for me, identity is any way that I think about myself. And I actually think the key thing with identity is the act of identification, which identification is I make that me. I make the way I think about myself me. And we can talk about the pros and cons of that. And Ricky, the way I've heard people say this, like in Conscious Leadership Plan, we talk about parts and persona work, which a lot of times when we're talking about parts and personas, we're talking about identities, conscious or unconscious. And the language I've heard people that I heard used that I like is some people have said you can have cardigan personas. They're kind of easy to take on and off. And you can have wetsuit personas that are really hard to see. They kind of feel like they're fused with their skin, and it's much more effort to take them on or off. And so what I think you're pointing to is there are ways that we can identify that they're easier to change, they're easier to flip on and off, and ways that we can be identified that are deeply ingrained, like close to our DNA as a person, and can be much, much more challenging to let go of and be more fluid with.
I like the persona thing. And I assume we'll probably bring that back up as we go through this. Ricky, what do you have anything to elaborate on for identity for you, or do you just like the 3 levels?
It was more, I was thinking about it today when I was like, okay, what is identity? And I was thinking about it in terms of how do we define it? And I do think it lives, for me at least, in those 3 different areas. There are some components that are like very deeply ingrained. They're the things that I've been telling, they're the stories that I've been telling myself, that others have been telling myself probably for my entire life. They're the ones that feel a little bit more adaptive and can be controlled and worked with. And there are the elements that are things that you can try on, like, oh, dry January. That's an identity, right? But I'm only doing it for the month of January. I'm just trying that on for a little bit. I'm someone who doesn't drink in the month of January and not a non-drinker. And so I think I stand by that as being my definition of recognizing that it encompasses all those things. I think the complication, Justin, you were describing this, is that it's anything that is how you characterize and identify yourself. I think one of the most complex things about identity is that so much of it often is around what other people think of us and how they have identified us as well, as part of the discomfort in identity. But yeah,
I actually think the biggest thing is the inverse, and this may come from our different, personalities and experiences. But for me, it's less so the identity of what other people think of us and more so of how we want other people to think of us. That's for me when identity gets really tricky. But
yeah.
We'll talk about it. We'll dive deeper into that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll hang out with my little 3 levels of identity.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk more about like persona and roles versus identity itself. So we can bring that up later, or whenever. For me, identity really comes down to how you label yourself. Like, how do I identify who I am, what I am in the world? So for me, it's just really a label. And for me, identity is an existential thing. It isn't necessarily just a role or a thing that you do or a thing that you pretend to be or play in public, right? I think for me, it tends to go much deeper. That can influence how you show up and how you play your role in different situations. But I think to a degree, your identity is much more existential for who you are.
I want to just 2 more thoughts as we're in here before we transition over. Corey, the thing that you're saying is important, the difference between roles and identity. And I know we'll dive deep into this, but this is why for me, identification, it's less of identity and more of identification is a action that we do. It's a psychological action. And you can see this, especially with founders, because some founders deeply identify as founder and CEO. And there are consequences to that. And I'll also notice other founders and CEOs who don't identify that. They're actually uncomfortable introducing themselves as, hey, I'm a founder, I'm a CEO. It's something I do during my day, but it's not something I identify as. And there are also consequences to not wearing the identity. And so, like you're saying, the key thing is identification. Do I go, I am AX, I am X, I am Y? That's the moment where, okay, now I'm identifying.
Agreed. I like that. So the next piece is, how does our identity or how we identify influence how we show up in the world, both internally and externally, like our own internal stories, thoughts, personal narratives, but also how we show up externally and interact with others? How does our identity influence all of that? I know it's a large question.
I want to, before we go direct with, like, if you're listening right now, this is actually the best thing to do with identity, in my experience, is to ask the question that Corey is asking to yourself about what you identify as. Right. So, like, for me, this was actually a pattern. I noticed I identify a lot as coach. I'm a coach. It's something I do. And there's a way where that empowers something for me and it also limits something for me. Right. So if I'm with you as a friend and we're just chatting and I'm in that moment identifying as coach, that may empower me to coach you. instead of just connect with you, instead of just be with you, instead of just be as friends together. And so I think the downstream consequences of identification is exactly what you're saying, Corey, which is there's something that it empowers and there's something that it limits, right? Like I even see leaders they identify as like, I am a direct leader. I am direct. And what that empowers is for them to keep being direct. But what that disempowers is for them to go against that identity at times when maybe they want to be more compassionate and more open. And so usually, in my experience, identities empower something and limit something.
Ricky, what are your thoughts?
I truly have no notes on that because I feel like that's such a good explanation of the complexity of identity, because even the element that you leverage, Justin, is something that's actually in many ways neutral. I'm a coach, right? And how that can be empowering and how it can also limit you in different situations. It's something that seems innocuous, right? I often think about identity more often when we are leveraging it as a protective measure. So when we say, oh, I'm stubborn, and therefore I then get to continue being stubborn because that is a identity element, it's a character trait, it's who I am as a person. It can serve me very well in moments that I need to move through something, but it can also limit me when I'm not willing to compromise or not willing to have an open discussion and not willing to have that creative response rather than my sort of initially planned response. So I think, I think you broke my brain for a second, because I think that I was thinking about more in terms of when we have a quality that might be more negative or positive and how that can kind of impact identity. But I think it's also, even with neutral terminology, that it still can sort of empower or can disempower. And I think that's a massive learning here. And I think it actually helps identify how important identification is that if you don't identify yourself as a coach and recognize that, you won't recognize, oh, how am I showing up in this conversation with my friend? Am I showing up as a friend or am I showing up as a coach?
Yeah. For me, they're only ever contextually positive or negative, right? Like even identities, you can't really give positive or negative, because we could take one example where if I identify as compassionate, in the world that the three of us live in, generally speaking, that's probably going to be net positive in terms of the effects that you want. But Ricky, already you found some exceptions, right? Whereas if I'm in a deeply hostile environment, if I'm in an environment where people want to take me down and hurt me and all that, well, if I identify as being compassionate for others, that may lead me to being trapped. And this is where identity gets really crunchy and identity change starts to happen, is where the identity is empowering something that I want, but it's also limiting something else that I also deeply want. And this is where identity gets crunchy, because suddenly it's like, oh, well, this identity is creating one thing I want, but not the other thing that I want. And then I'm either confronted with changing the identity or risking stepping outside of it altogether, which is one of the more terrifying processes in transformation, which is what we all do as coaches. So we've strayed a little far from the question, but I wanted to slot that in because I do think that's where we're talking about the effects of identities. And I think this is the effect. And then there's a process of reckoning with that and shifting out of it.
Well, and so I'm a big fan of the whole idea of your identity can empower you or enslave you, right? Like a lot of people, and we'll get into, later about how your identity can become a crutch as well, which is a form of enslavement. But this whole idea of really learning to be aware of what is your identity, or what identities do you tend to carry around with you, and how do those influence you in day-to-day life, right? So this doesn't come up nearly as often now that I coach, but when I did therapy, one of the predominant identities that a lot of people struggled with, which is why they had issues enough to come to therapy, was fundamentally they identified as a victim. So what happens when you identify as a victim is that skews your perception, right? It basically identifying, your identity acts as like a filter for how you see the world, how you perceive the world, right? So if I identify as a victim, I tend to see things out in the world that reinforce my identity as a victim. I tend to unintentionally seek out and remember events that I perceive to be victimizing for me. Okay. Maybe I don't speak up in conversations, so then I get overruled. Oh, I feel victimized by that, right? Or, oh, I unintentionally get into relationships that are very one-sided, and then I end up getting taken advantage of, aka I feel victimized again. So then I consistently fill this role of victim because I identify as a victim, right? And that's a large part of, especially with therapy, but the whole self-help industry, all this other shit, coaching, a lot of times it's really just about helping you reconstruct your identity towards something you actually want. It's just how we go about that differs between therapy, coaching, and, again, self-help books and shit. There's just one person I work with. Dream analysis is complete and utter bullshit. We can do a whole episode on it at some point, but spoiler alert, I call fucking bullshit on it. But work with this one person, and every single day, every single interaction, they were the victim, no matter what happened. Even their dreams, like they came to therapy one time and they're like, hey, I keep having these really fucked up dreams where I'm chased by wolves and disemboweled. And I'm like, look, I'm not a dream interpretation person, because dream interpretation is fucking bullshit. However, the consistent theme, right? Like if you dream of a ladder, it symbolizes you're going to come into wealth. That's fucking bullshit. Okay. But if a common theme in your dreams is that you are the recipient of violence, aka you are a victim, and that is consistent with how you identify in your waking hours, that's probably the theme. That's probably what's going on. Okay. Logically. And then over time, we were able to help them reconstruct their identity away from being a victim. But that was a huge component. So it was like, no matter what I see in the world, no matter what objectively happens in the world, my identity as a victim skews my perception of what is going on in the world. So all I see are things that reinforce my identity, right? And this goes for all of us, right? Whatever your identity is, I don't like the word subconsciously or unconsciously, but we inadvertently seek out things that reinforce our identity. If our identity is empowering, then we reinforce things, or we seek out things and remember things that reinforce our identity of being empowered, right? And the converse is also true. So this is one way of how your identity influences how you show up and how your internal and external states become reconciled. If I identify as this, I seek out things that reinforce this identity. Mm-hmm. Which is why you have to be super, super careful of the identities you carry around with you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Justin.
One last thing on this point before we move on. And there's actually two things. One of the questions I asked, we talk about personas and parts work. I learned this specific question from Gay and Katie Hendricks, which is, when you're in this identity, what other characters need to be out in the world? And it helps you see that identities give you lenses that then project their view of the world out into it. So, for example, Corey, with a classic victim identity, what does that require? Well, it requires villains. It requires bad people who are trying to do things to me. And so we project that out, or we look for that and find it to confirm the identity's use for us. Because most identities, again, they're trying to help us. They're trying to protect us. And so they also want to convince you, hey, I'm right about this. I'm right about the world. The other thing, since we're just on a little tear about victimhood, for high-performing folks, a lot of high-performing folks will go, no, I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim. I don't have any of this. From my training with a conscious leadership group, they say, and this is also a psychological concept. I think it's called Karpman's drama triangle, is where it originally came from. And what he says is, when we're in to me or victim consciousness, we're in three roles. We're in the victim role, which is these bad people did this to me. We're in a villain role, which goes, they're the bad people. They're the problem. Notice still to me. There are these weak people doing this thing to me. Or we're in a hero role, which is temporarily trying to solve the problem without really getting to the core of it. And so what a lot of high functioning victimhood looks like for high performing people on the show is the martyr. Oh, look at all these people, or the martyr or the hero. Look at all these people. They're not performing. I'm just going to get it done. I'm just going to power through. Or like the righteous blamer, like, you're wrong. None of these people are doing it wrong. I'm doing that. All of this, while it feels empowering, are still victimhood identities that keep you in a place. So just notice, identities that live in victim can be more than, oh, woe is me. this keeps happening to me.
I like that. And then one other thing I'll kind of touch on here is a lack of identity can also influence how you show up in the world, right? So Justin, I think it was you in the YFC community this week. We were talking about it. We had somebody who was new to coaching, and they're a professional outside of coaching. They're actually a psychologist, and they've done therapy, and they were like, I struggle to call myself a coach, and therefore I struggle to put myself out there to get coaching clients. And I think it was your suggestion. It was basically just like, why don't you just start fucking calling yourself a coach? Like, just start there. Basically, start by reshaping your identity of I am a coach, and therefore I am looking for coaching clients. That was a huge like reframe for them of just like, you can literally just call yourself a coach. Like, you don't have to, oh, well, I do this and I do that. And like, just the fact that you're not calling yourself a coach basically is translating into you're not giving yourself permission to offer coaching, because a lot of us feel like we have to be the thing before we can do the thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of us wait to get permission to call ourselves the thing so that then we can go do the thing. But it's like, if you just start calling yourself a coach, or if you just start calling yourself a whatever, that can, again, just, it reframes your perception and how you show up. Like, oh, fuck, I'm a coach, or, oh, I'm a writer, or, oh, I'm this, oh, I'm that. Like, I see so many people struggle with this too, of I want to do X, but I'm not Y. I want to write a thing, but I'm not a writer. But people like me, but this, but that. It's like, it isn't your identity so much as like it's your lack of identity. You don't identify as the thing, and that is becoming problematic because that is influencing how you show up in the world, meaning you're not showing up in the world as this thing.
Yeah. The one downstream thing I'll add to this, Corey, that you're pointing to is, identities also help others to identify you. And so sure, it has internal effects on what it empowers, and usually a downstream effect is other people can point to you and go, yup, they're XYZ.
I think even the power of the language helps you identify you. Mm-hmm. So if I'm saying to myself, oh, I'm a writer, suddenly I can make decisions from a place of, well, what would I do as a writer? I am a writer. That means that I should sit down and spend some time writing today. Whereas if I say, I wish I could be a writer, I want to be a writer, that's something that I wish I could be, then why would I make time for it? But if I say I am a writer, then it shifts. Then it's into, well, how do I prove it, basically? How do I continue to show up for myself as this writer that I am? I think James Clear, Atomic Habits, he openly says that almost his entire book has nothing in it that's new except for the identity component, which is that if you want to make a habitual shift, having it tied to identity will assist in that. So rather than saying, I want to become a runner, saying I am a runner, that is my identity, will actually help unlock, because then it's like, okay, how do I make sure that I'm getting my next run in? Like, I haven't run for a year because I was pregnant and had a baby and all that stuff. And I still call myself, I'm a runner. And I don't, because I know that like I am working myself back into being able to run. If I wasn't calling myself a runner, I would just be feeling guilty. I would just be like, oh man, I'm not there yet. But instead, I still say it.
Clear at the end of that chapter, here's the most incredible thing about Atomic Habits. He basically says, this is the single most important thing you can do. This is the single most important thing out of everything else that comes after this book. Is like the sprinkles on top of the sundae of identity change, which is funny because everybody talks about everything after that, but he himself, James Clear, if you're listening, which I'm sure you are, we're such an esteemed, huge podcast, you need to write a second book exclusively dedicated to that chapter.
And come on our podcast.
And come on the podcast.
Come, please, Liz. But like when he's interviewed, he always talks about the fact that the entire book, he's like, there's nothing fucking new in there. Like he says it openly. He's like, the only one is this identity component. And so I think that makes a big difference, Corey. Like when someone says, I am a coach, I am a writer, I am a runner, it helps unlock how you see yourself, how you make decisions from that place, and also how others see you as well.
Agreed. We were going to jump on.
Disagree.
Well, no, we were going to talk about that later. But
sorry.
No, it's fine. Like, it's fine. I don't give a shit. My identity is not so rigid that I identify as an organized person. But
I
I
read the notes.
I identify as chaos, but I do want to circle back to that more in depth here in a bit. Because I knew James Clear was going to come up because he can't not come up because, like you said, like that's the best takeaway of that. And you see that identity based habits and goal setting and shit a lot. But my thing is, before we get to the more positive side, the more empowering side, and like how to kind of construct it intentionally, I want to talk about how our identity can be an obstacle. So that is the first version of this question. How can our identity, or how we identify, however you want to describe this, how can that become an obstacle?
Literally all the time. Would you like me to repeat the story that I told you guys from before we were recording today? Let me tell you about an identity obstacle. No, I think that we often have components within ourselves that they can become an obstacle because we leverage them as blockers. We actually leverage them. We like them. Okay. And they can be things about ourselves that we don't like, but we've already identified them. We say, I'm a procrastinator, and therefore I procrastinate, right? Sometimes it's, am I truly a procrastinator, or am I saying that because it makes me feel better about the fact that I'm procrastinating right now? Same with, there's oh my God, guys, this week is tough. So example, right? In my family, there is a joke about me that I identify with, which is that I have a high pain tolerance. There's many stories to back this up. There's many examples in my life that I've accidentally done something really fucking stupid because I have a high pain tolerance. I think that's actually just being a woman, but many stories in my life. There's a story about the time that I tore my meniscus and was like, I think something's messed up with my knee. We should maybe get it looked at, whatever. Let's go grocery shopping anyway. Ballooned up, needed to do an abs. It was insane, right? This past weekend, was visiting family, decided I had food poisoning from Taco Bell. I'm so sorry, Taco Bell. We have a great relationship, but this was a moment for us. Literally trying to talk my family into driving home. I was like, let's drive home. It'll be fine. My husband and my mother both are looking at each other and they're like, one of us needs to talk sense into this woman, right? This is a moment that it's technically a strong thing, right? I have a high pain tolerance. It's amazing. Look at me. Look how great I am. Look how impressive. And they're looking at me like, you're a fucking crazy person. You're pale as fuck. You're a little bit shaky. You're making weird noises. And we think you need to go see a physician, right? But because I am so convinced that I'm someone that's like, no, I'll just make it through it. I'll just make it through it. Obviously, I was having appendicitis. I needed to have my appendix taken out this week. But I think that these are examples that something that is technically, for me, something I'm proud of, right? I love being able to say, oh, I have a high pain tolerance. But then I do stupid fucking shit like this that actually put myself at risk or at danger. And so a couple small examples, some simple ones of procrastination. Am I doing it because I say I'm a procrastinator, or is that just something that I'm telling myself that allows me to not do the thing that I need to do? I think we can often use it as a little cloak, whether it's positive or negative or neutral.
Yeah. I think I want to talk about what identities do. And Corey, there's kind of a question on how they form, and we can get there. But for me, what identities fundamentally do is they help us make sense of the world. They help limit the world. They help us move forward, right? And if anybody's ever done deep plant medicine work or really deep meditation work, you can hit points where you're beyond identity. And let me tell you, it can be profound and awe-inspiring, but it's very disorienting. It is a challenging way to move through the world. If you don't have identities and these neural circuits that are limiting the amount of data and automatically making sense of them and helping you move through the world. And so without identities, this is deeply tied to emotion, you would have a very hard time doing anything. But the cost is right in what they do, right? They are limiting the amount of data that you can actually consciously evaluate. they are quickly jumping to conclusions, and therefore they're limiting what's possible for you. And so when you're really in an identity and you can't see it and you can't be fluid with it and hold it, what you can actually see is limited, right? Usually you're buying a story, and therefore the possibilities are deeply limited. And really, lastly, for deep-seated identities, they cling. Because in your kind of like psychological structure, they're going, no, you really need me. You really need me to make sense of the world. You really need me to be safe. If you let go of me, if you go against what I'm seeing and saying, you're going to be fucked. I like this example of Ricky, like using personal examples. I would say 2 identities that are very empowering but very limiting for me are, I wrote them down here. I want to be the best at what I do. That one empowers a whole bunch of stuff for me and fucks me when I'm in it. And for me, there's another kind of mental construct we can use, like wanting to be nice and compassionate, and especially seen as nice and compassionate. And for there's actually an anti-identity. So alongside of this, like frequently our identities say, well, we can't identify as this way, which for me is like mean and angry and rageful. And what gets limited for that is, what gets limited for that is a whole bunch of possibilities, right? Like when I'm really, we've used the show as an example for, when I'm really like, I need to be nice and everything, I don't voice the ways that I think the show could be better. I don't voice the parts of the show that are frustrating me that could be changed. When I identify as that I want to be the best, it really helps me push forward. But when I have sessions, this happened this morning. Let me fully reveal myself. I had a session that was fine. It was fine. It was a fine coaching session. The person at the end said something like, hey, this was really useful. Thank you. But me, who identified as like, I want to be the best coach possible, was like, that wasn't a fucking magical session though. Ricky, you use this language, magical sessions. And there's a part of me where I can really beat myself and get like tied up when every session is like, I didn't hit like a grand slam in every session. Even when the person across from me went, that was really useful. Thank you. And so again, each of these things you can feel into, like, what do they help you see? What do they help you not see? It was only afterward when I cooled down where I went, wait, he told me it was a really useful session. But it took me 15 minutes. I was so wrapped up in, was that the best that it could be, that I actually totally missed the positive feedback. This is what identities do.
It's that lens that the two of you have been talking about, right? Is that if I want to be the best, then every interaction I'm looking at, am I being the best? And there's also some complication there, which is that especially in partnership of being the best, that individual had a very good session, right? Sometimes, and some of what you're even describing in terms of being kind and nice and wanting to be perceived as kind as nice is really complicated, because you could be kind and nice from your perspective, and the other individual doesn't feel like you're kind or nice, and they didn't like your tone, or they didn't like the word choice you used, or the language that you use. And so I think that's part of the complexity of identity, is that we use it as a lens to see ourselves and to see the world around us. And the complexity that we run into is that we're not in a vacuum when we're dealing with identity, right? I can't sit here and say, this is who I am, because part of who I am is how do I move through the world with these identities? How do I move through my day-to-day? How do I interact with others? How do others perceive me? And that makes it very complicated. Identity is not something that I get to go into a room and come out and say, I am now raw vegan. Hear ye, hear ye. Like that doesn't work that way. It's a complexity, because not only do I have to identify as that, I have to live as that, I have to act as that, I have to live and breathe that, everybody else has to see it. I think it's why it's so complicated. It feels like it should be an individual effort, and I think it's constantly informed by the world around us.
Agreed. My thing, so a couple things. I think frequently people start off with an empowering but rigid identity, and then when that identity breaks down, they have a fucking identity crisis, right? Like there's a whole fucking reason we have the term identity crisis, because you're like, I am not what I thought I was, or I cannot be what I was and what I think I am, right? So classic examples are like an athlete. Athlete is a very empowering identity to have, but what happens when you are an athlete with a career-ending injury? And you're like, well, fuck, I'm not an athlete anymore. I cannot be an athlete, right? Like I cannot do this, especially like in professional sports, right? Like I can't do this thing anymore, at least at the level I was. What am I? What do I do now? What am I now? Because I am not an athlete specifically based on how I rigidly defined athlete. Right. Now you do see a lot of, former athletes, or, I mean, again, depending on how you define athlete, right? Like you can be like, you don't have to be a professional, NFL, whatever athlete to be an athlete, to be athletic. Right. But that's why you see a lot of them switch into coaching, like being like a sports coach. Right. But that is a really hard transition for some people. Right. Or if you just retire, not even if you get injured, your career's just over. What are you now? Right. Or just, and I'm assuming you can speak more to this specifically, but like if you identify as a founder and then you have an exit, you're not a founder. You're not like actively a founder in the same respect. Right. So then you see people in this capacity like, what the fuck do I do now? Right. Because, and frequently, at least I anyway, see people, they're like, I'm still a founder, so I'm just going to build something else. Because like I don't know how to not be a founder sometimes, right? Just what for that specific thing, like what are your experiences?
Yes, and more frequently the cost I see is they terrify themselves with the prospect of failure, their company failing, and get really reactive and collapse because they're identified as founder. And frequently, founders actually identify with their company. They identify as company. Therefore, company failing and dying feels like a personal death, which again, pros and cons. Pros are, I am very motivated not to die. The cons are, I stop thinking clearly. I can't see as many possibilities. I'm not as creative. I can't see that, well, maybe this company can die and then I can try again in a different way. And so, actually, there was a point I was writing here, which is, it reminds me of a point that I made in our limiting beliefs episode, which I think I said something like, if you go deeply enough into a limiting belief and you start to change it, there's going to be a moment where you're going to be terrified because reality is going to fall apart. And Corey, you were pointing to this. This is how my experience is with identities, which is if you're consciously trying to shift identities or if it happens to you, there is a moment where it feels like a death. It feels like something is dying. Something inside of you is dying. Reality as you know it or knew it is completely shattering and falling apart. And like in the process of evolution, learning to get comfortable with that incredible level of discomfort and having spaces where you can exist beyond all of your identities is really useful. We'll get there, but that's more frequently what I see, Corey, is. And there's other ways that people can identify as, actually, I've seen founders identify as having successful exits and then identify as a successful founder and then have a really hard time getting back up on the horse because they feel the need to de-risk something so big because they can't lose the identity of a successful founder. Can you imagine if their second company failed? And so they have a really hard time moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, like again, I think in our limiting beliefs episode, when I talk about the 4 Horsemen of Fear, right, a lot of these can be related to identity stuff. So specifically, one of them is fear of success. And this whole idea of why would I be afraid to achieve the thing I claim to want? Well, one of the common things I've heard when I've worked with founders and entrepreneurs is I identify as an underdog or as the underdog. If I quote unquote succeed, I'm no longer the underdog. I'm the incumbent or whatever the term is, right? My identity as an underdog has always been a superpower. I can't lose that identity because by losing the identity of an underdog, I lose my superpower, my competitive edge. So that can lead to me self-sabotaging to avoid or prolong achieving success. so that I can maintain my identity as the underdog, right? So that can be another thing. Like for me, so like I've talked before, like, I grew up food stamps, public housing, pretty poor, and in rural Appalachia, right? So I identified as one of the poor kids, right? Like me and a lot of my friends throughout school, like we were the poor kids. Like we got the free lunches at school. We couldn't go on vacations. We couldn't like middle school and high school, like when they would go to like Washington, D.C. for some fucking field trip, like we could never go, right? And it was like, we weren't going to ask our parents even, because it's like, I don't even want to put that stress on my parents, right? Because I'm like, I'm assuming you're not going to be able to afford it anyway. I'm just not going to, right? So then that identity of I'm the poor kid really affected me throughout life, right? Now, it eventually became sort of like from the poor kid to like the underdog. So it became very empowering of like, I'm gritty as fuck and resilient as fuck, right? But it can sometimes, even today, be this thing where like I'm self-sufficient. I don't need to ask for help. I don't want to ask for help. I don't want to celebrate things, right? Like if you see me celebrate, like I will occasionally celebrate something very, very briefly. Like I will, and we've talked before about like emotions and shit, right? Like how I'm pretty stoic, like upper and lowercase stoic, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some are tied to identity, but this whole idea of like,
I was going to say that's even an identity.
Exactly,
I identify as stoic. Yeah,
exactly. And part of that is I just try to not get my hopes up, but also not give in to any specific emotional state for very long, because I got used to like, don't get your hopes up for something because it may not happen. Right. And that's, again, like that's been a superpower for me over time, in that it's also allowed me to avoid the pitfalls of negative emotions, what I label as the negative emotions. But it's this thing of that identity as the poor kid influenced the majority of how I showed up in life, right? Like that influenced like me, like I literally read the dictionary in the bathroom. Like my mom still will tell just random fucking strangers like, oh, when Corey was young, like when he would go to the bathroom to poop, he would just keep a dictionary by the toilet and he would just read all these fucking words, to where now like I love etymology and I know a lot of random fucking words that you would never know because all I say is fuck. But like that influenced me. I'm like, I'm the poor kid. I don't have the resources my friends, my co-students or whatever, who are from like middle class or upper middle class. I don't have the same advantages they have because I'm the poor kid. So in order for me to compete with them, I have to compete with them on an intellectual level, right? That influenced a lot of the trajectory of my life, and it has been a huge asset over time, right? But when I got to college, I was like, okay, I'm Appalachian, but I don't want to be Appalachian. Because everybody I saw who was quote unquote successful, other entrepreneurs, other doctors, shit like that, they didn't have my accent. They weren't from where I was from. So I was like, well, if I want to be successful, then I can't be this. If I want to succeed, I can't be Appalachian. I can't be from up a holler. Like I can't identify as being from up a holler, right? And I remember specifically, like I put dedicated time into trying to lose my identity, or my identity and my accent, right? Like I tried to have a more even keel accent. And there was one time I was at a fraternity party, and I don't drink. I haven't drank since I was in high school, but everybody at the party was drinking. So then they started to get a little more casual, right? And we realized at a certain point in the party, everybody had a strong accent that hadn't come up because everybody, was typically sober. So then when they started drinking, that facade came down, and all of a sudden we're like, holy shit, like we all have accents. Why have we all been hiding this? And it's like, well, because I was trying to quote unquote fit in, right? Because it was like, I can't have this identity if I want to succeed. And like from that moment, I was like, fuck all that. Like letting my accent come back in, like really leaning into like the identity and my upbringing and things of being Appalachian, learning to be proud of my upbringing. Right. And then that has been an asset too. And I've written about that, of like, I'm a doctor, I'm an entrepreneur, and I say y'all. right? Like that's, you know, have a whole piece about that. Um, but that can be other areas where like how you identify can really help or harm you in the long run. So learning to see like, does this have pros and cons? Does it only have cons? Does it only have pros? It rarely only has pros. It may, but rarely. But if you are not aware of the cons, those cons are going to blindside you one day.
Mm-hmm. Corey, just a collection of points here.
Yeah.
One, we hit this point again where it was like I tried to identify as a rejection of this other identity. In my experience, identities that express in the unhealthiest way and also are the stickiest. So Ricky, to your point of like down to the bones, are ones that came from a very early rejection of some other identity that you saw, right? So frequently it's like you had a really angry parent and you went, I don't want to be angry. Therefore, I'm going to be nice and kind, and I'm trapped in people pleasing. It's because, sure, you have a people pleaser identity, but it's actually deeply hooked to an anti-identity that you're going, I can't be that. Therefore, I need to be this. And so if you really want to go, and I'll talk more through how to start to identify some of your identities, look for the things that you go, I am not, or rather, I will not be. That's going to be a really good source of inquiry. And what I'll also say is some of these most deep-seated identities can really hide. There's the David Foster Wallace talk, This is Water, where there's, the story with the fish where, there's two young fish swimming along and the older fish goes, how's the water today, boys? And the two younger fish look at each other and they go, what the hell is water? Frequently, our most deep-seated identities are this way. They're water to us. They are so the world that we live in that we can't actually see them. And so it can take a lot of work, or frequently we go to therapists and coaches, and really what the coaches are helping us see is the identities that we ourselves could not see. And so if it's funny, I do a lot of persona work, which is this kind of identity work. And usually we hit a point where I've identified like 6 of them, and somebody will pause and they'll kind of look at me and they'll go, Justin, how many personas do I have? And then we have the fun thing is I go, it's infinite. You can have infinite identities. They don't end. And so you have countless of these things, and the process is when you feel stuck and limiting, starting to inquire into what's the identity here that might be maybe sticking me.
I like that. Ricky, do you have anything to add to this point?
I do not.
Okay. So then a related question. What do people tend to get wrong about identity?
Well, the first two thought that identity is primarily about what other people think of us rather than what we think of us. I think usually if we're fighting really hard with what other people think of us, it's because we actually don't feel settled into what we want to be identified as. Because if I'm really settled into it, I don't care. And trust me, as somebody who is very frequently triggered by what people think of them, I am not saying that you shouldn't be that way, but normally I know this for myself. If you say something and it really gets me, and I'm like, I'm not that way, I'm this way, it's because I'm not totally convinced. I'm not actually settled into that. And the second thing is that identity change is as simple as starting to say to yourself, I am X. That's the first step, but identity change is a mother. It is a process. It is a bunch of work. You like James Clear in Atomic Habits. This is where I think he kind of did a disservice to everybody. He basically tells you, hey, you got to start going, no, I am a runner. I am healthy. But that doesn't stop the other voice that goes, no, you're not. You're not an athlete. You're not a runner. You're not healthy. And swapping identities isn't just as easy as going, I am X. You really have to learn and feel and understand the current identity. And frankly, like kind of the language I use is get it enrolled and you trying something different. It's almost like having a conversation with that part of you that like the part of me that's like, you got to be nice, man. You got to be nice. This is going to be kind of dickish, and go, I kind of have to have a conversation with myself. Be like, well, let's try being a dick and see what happens here. Being a dick. Those are really the big ones that show up for me right off the cuff.
I'm fully aligned with those, Justin. I think the biggest one with identity is that most often our identity is something that we have adopted, that has been sort of like placed upon us and we have not necessarily signed up for. And so it could be how you were raised, what was shared with you, how you sort of move through life. And I think that for a lot of us, the complexity that we get around identity wrong is the decision that that is then who we are, right? It's all bones, in my first point in the beginning of this conversation. And in fact, bones can be broken, right? We can take out a hip, possibly find someone to make dice out of it. Ultimately, the thing that we get wrong around it is that we often let others define us, or other experiences externally define who we are. Whereas if we spend time and think about it, we can actually think about, well, where was I in this process? Rather than what was happening around me, where was I in the process? What was I doing? What were the personas? What were the tasks? What were the actions that I was taking on? And so to me, I think the biggest thing that we get wrong about identity is the idea of it is like given to us. When in fact, I think that we are able to sort of be curious around it and form it ourselves. Now, that, to be fair, like Justin was saying, identity shift, identity work, really complicated, right? Like I always talk about, your reaction is almost always the same. It's your response that changes. Our reaction is almost always the same, but it's our response that can change, right? If someone does something that makes us angry, and we are working on not having anger as our response, we're still going to feel probably a little bit of anger. The difference is the anger this big? Is it this big? Is it really big? And that reaction will still occur. And then it's, how do I respond in this identity that I am now adopting?
What about you, Corey?
So I kind of see two things that people frequently get wrong beyond what you all have said. One is that identity is one dimensional. Like, I am this, period. Or they try to find like an all-encompassing identity, which just isn't a thing. Like, you are not a one-dimensional person. Like, you are multidimensional. And I don't even mean like you exist on a higher plane and fucking aliens and some shit. Just like legitimately, like, you're not just one thing, right? Like, you do multiple things. You have multiple identities, or at least typically should, right? But when you say like, I am this. So for example, when I was in grad school and we were doing like internship interviews and shit, one of the questions that people would ask is, so tell me more, like, tell me about yourself, right? Super, super basic question. And it's like, every single one of us struggled with was like, I'm a grad student. And they're like, yes, what else do you do? And we're all like, fucking nothing. All I do is grad school. I'm in this fucking building for 12 hours a day. That's all the fuck I do. So and that was just like, well, you're fucking boring, right? Like, we struggled so much to have an identity beyond that, because one, for so long, we wanted that identity. I want to be accepted into this doc program so that I can say that I'm a doc student. I'm a PsyD student. Well, now that I am this, that's all the fuck I wanted. So then when you ask me to describe other aspects of myself, I'm like, I don't fucking know. I have now shoehorned my entire identity into one thing that is very rigid and not all encompassing, right? Because clearly I did other things. There were other parts of me, but I had kind of blinded myself to them to go all in on this one rigid, one dimensional identity, right? And I think a lot of people struggle with that as well. Then the other thing I see is people assume their identity can't change, right? And this is when it gets into like learned helplessness, right? So we're talking about victim shit earlier, but I'll even use myself as an example, like with the poor kid thing. Now at this point, I'm like, poor kid is like a term of endearment sort of thing, like, right? Like when I talk to my other friends who is like, they've become successful, it's like, oh, you were the poor kid too, right? Like, you develop that grit, that tenacity, that resilience that, we don't want our kids to have to go through the same thing, but we hope they get those traits without going through those trials, right? Which is really hard to do. But it's that camaraderie. But a lot of my childhood friends who we don't talk anymore, haven't seen them in, close to 15, 20 years, at least closer to 20 years. Mostly because a lot of them are in prison. Separate story for another day. At the time, even though we all quote unquote identified as a poor kids, I said, I am a poor kid now, and therefore I am going to do what it takes to break that cycle, right? To educate myself, to learn skills, to then generate that income, to then help my parents, help myself, break that cycle, do all this other shit, right? But a lot of those friends at the time, they said, I am a poor kid now, and therefore I can't be anything else. I can't be anything more. I will always just be the poor kid. So they saw it as my identity can't change. They had this learned helplessness of no matter what I do, my situation can't change, right? If you want like a very simple explanation of learned helplessness from a psychological perspective, if you've ever seen horses with an electric fence, right? Electric fences frequently are turned off. I wouldn't recommend going up and squeezing one or pissing on one, but they're frequently turned off because they can be energy intensive sometimes. What you do is you put a horse in a fucking area with this thin little wire around it and you turn it on. And at first the horse is like, this is just this thin little wire. I can clearly just leave anytime I want. But when the horse goes up to it, it gets shocked. And it's like, oh, fuck, that's super painful. Let me try it again. Oh, let me try one more time. Well, fuck, I can't leave. No matter what I do, I cannot leave this. Then you can turn off the electric fence. So it's literally just a thin fucking wire. And the horse is like, I can't leave. No matter what, I cannot leave. That is learned helplessness. A lot of people feel they have quote unquote learned that they are helpless to change themselves or their situation. And then that becomes rooted in their identity of this is not only this is what I am, this is all I am and all I will ever be.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a great Corey's story about how identities frequently form, which is there's an unpleasant experience that I have. There's some pain that happens. I come up with a story about myself and the world, and then I identify, right? Again, I'm going to go back to this example of anger because I think it's very common for people. I have an angry parent that makes me feel scared. Anger is bad. Therefore, I'm not angry. I'm nice. And frankly, I think being nice is a better way to move through the world, which works a lot of the time, except for when it doesn't. And then frequently what somebody comes up with is this is the limiting purview of identities. They go, well, if I'm not nice, like it's not going to help me get what I want. And it can be a behemoth task to challenge that story and step out into identity and see that, hey, sometimes when I'm not nice, it actually helps me get what I want way better than being nice does. But that's the exact way that identities build themselves up. And then they tell you they're right because they go, well, if you try and go against my story, like it's not going to work out for you. And then we got to challenge the stories.
I think there's also a component around you were making me think of, which is that I also think there's a component around deciding what the specifics of that identity means to you. So I am a runner could mean, oh, I run 5 times a week. I run half marathons. I run full marathons. I'm a runner could mean I do a light jog every 2 weeks. And I'm not going much faster than how fast I walk. And I'm doing it, but I'm a runner, right? And I think
this is an example very personal to Ricky's life. I love
really,
this.
Really close to me.
Yeah.
Because I think about it because they talk about it a lot with mothers. Women, if a woman becomes a mom, a huge component of that they talk about is the identity shift of becoming a mother, which is not even including the hormonal shifts and the lack of sleep and all these things. Suddenly you are now mother and you go through society as mother and you are now a woman with children. And that's a really big societal identity shift that occurs within an individual, which is that when you are seen out in the world, whether you're pregnant or have a child with you, you are treated differently than when you move through the world without those things attached to you. It's a very physical representation of an identity shift that you are experiencing. And that being said, it's also a component that some people they let that happen, right? They just allow that identity to occur. I guess this is happening. I guess I have to say goodbye to my old life. And what I actually think becoming a parent for however that happens for someone, is a huge component of identity work, of deciding, how do I want to be as a parent? How do I want to exist in this new world? What are the ramifications? What does this look like on a day-to-day basis? How does it look like for me to be a mom, right? And that, I think that's a massive component that, as we were talking about identity, I was like, we can't ignore this component, that this is like a huge thing that a lot of people go through in this world, that's a massive identity shift that occurs in a moment that suddenly you are a parent. And now that is your identity, especially for women. I don't think it happens as much for men. And so my point here is that when it comes to the component of the identity, it's also important for you to spend time with thinking about, how do you identify with the identity, and also how do you navigate that identity, and how does it show up for you? I'm a runner, could be marathons, could be jog. I'm a mother, could be stay-at-home trad life, or it could be strap on that baby, we're traveling the world, right? You still get to choose, how does that identity work within your life?
Like, what are your expectations of that identity, of embodying that identity, or accepting
exactly.
And this is the trippy thing about identification. Once you have a kid, you are a mother. There's a fact there. But some people don't necessarily identify with that.
Exactly.
Some people, mothering or parenting is something that they do. Same thing, Ricky. You identify as, I am a runner because I do a light jog every couple things. Like me, I've been getting back into running lately. I've been running like much more than that, but I wouldn't tell you I'm a runner. It's not something that I identify with. And so again, there's also some things, we notice the things that you don't need to identify with at all. They can just be things that you do. And then notice the things that you deeply identify with. And again, what does that empower and what does that cost you? Like Corey, for example, he identifies as a runner. He identifies as an avid runner.
Yeah,
Corey
loves running.
Corey
loves running.
Loves running. He's starting a new running podcast, I think.
It's his favorite
I'm running
thing.
right now.
It's his favorite thing.
All right.
That's a good, but to that joke, like, that's an example. Like, I specifically unidentify as a runner. I was like, I'm not a runner. I actively don't fucking run. I do jujitsu so that I don't have to fucking run. If I ever am chased by something, I'm tripping the closest fucking person. That's like, I don't have to be faster than the bear. I just have to be faster than you. That's it, right? But that's a good example. So logically, the next piece is, how do our identities tend to develop? Because, like, for people listening or / watching, so I'm a clinical psychologist, right? There are many different types of psychologists, many different fields of psychology. There are developmental psychologists who specifically focus on our identities and how we develop across the lifespan, right? Like, there's child development, there's adult development, there's, aging, like all that other shit, right? So identity development is its own specific niche within the larger field of psychology, because there's a lot around this. And I have a guy at some point we might look into inviting on the podcast. He's incredible with identity development things. His name's Dr. Keelan Hinton. Keelan is the reason I'm a psychologist, like, full stop, because of how he sees psychology and identity development shit. But how do our identities develop? What influences the development of our identities?
Yeah. I'm just going to go with, so usually when I work with people with identities, it's with this persona and parts work. And one of the questions we frequently will ask once we've identified a persona and dive into it is, who did this persona, where did this identity learn its style from? Ricky, you've asked this question before in some episode, like, who taught you that? You said. And usually you get one of three answers. The most common answer is X or Y prominent figure in my early life exhibited this. And identification is a perfectly natural human and psychological thing to do. Again, it's how we make sense of the world. And I just picked it up from their modeling. It was modeled to me and I absorbed it. The second most common answer was oppositionally. Again, it was an anti-identity. Some prominent figure or some really painful experience happened to me. And I went, nope, I'm either not going to be like them, or I'm not going to be the way I was when that happened to me. I made myself vulnerable. That hurt. Therefore, I will not be vulnerable. This is another, people identify as strong because the times where they let themselves be seen as weak or vulnerable, some painful thing happened. And the third one, which is the least common, but it does happen, was I just figured out that when I identified as this way, or I was this way, it got me something that I wanted. And the identity just solidified because I was employing this. You have a few people who, they drive themselves really hard, and I'll go, "Who'd you learn that from?" And like, it actually wasn't my parents. My parents held a lot of space, but they also weren't too relaxed. I think at some point I just learned a temporary strategy where if I was really critical of myself, I did better. And so I just started doing that. And so those are the three ways I see them developing.
Friends, I'm not quite sure. Like, I feel like an ass saying that, but there is a piece of me. It's like, to me, so much of the identity component is that some of it, I think, just sort of happens as we grow. It's sort of just is a response to our existence. And some of it is a proactive decision around our existence. So I think, some of it, for example, let's say you're young and you seem to be speedy. Your parents might say, hey, put them on the track team. I'm a runner now, right? Whereas you're older and you're looking for a way to be strong and feel physically fit, and you decide, I'm going to become a runner. I think I think some of them, they're sort of like put on us, and then we absorb them and take them in and experience life through them, and they get more solid. And I think some of them, we kind of pluck them and we say, I want this, and I can make this happen, and I can play with this, and I can work with this. And then that is about continuing to mold it and put it into our form. But I'm not sold, y'all. I don't fucking know. I didn't study this shit. Corey, tell us something. Tell us something good. Tell me something. Give me something here.
So part of it, and this is there's a lot of debate, and like nature nurture is typically a hybrid because they influence each other. But to an extent, we do have our own, for lack of a better term, predefined proclivities for identity. Like you can see like little kids, right? Like super young kids, like you can typically see like some kids are more shy, some are more outgoing, some are kinder, some are more selfish, like beyond what is typically normal for like your quote unquote average kid. So we do tend to have baseline proclivities toward one direction or the other. But then a lot of that is also influenced by our environment, right? This can be our parents, this can be our culture, right? Like I see a lot of that influence with people from different cultures, whether they are first generation or what they call TKOs, third culture kids, whatever the fuck that is, TCO, I guess. Your culture tends to really influence how you identify, especially if your culture also tends to come with a religion or religious practices that can also really influence your identity. Especially if you live in more like insulated-ish communities where it's mostly other people of your culture and or heritage, religion, shit like that, that'll really influence your identity. And then just your experiences as you continue to develop across the lifespan, right? Because again, we tend to seek things that reinforce our identity. So what starts off as maybe a little bit of a proclivity and a little bit of what's going on in your house, then you continue to seek things out that reinforce that, right? And there's this thing is called Bronfenbrenner is the model. Basically micro, meso, and macro influences and things. Micro is like your house. Meso is, and your little community. Meso is the things slightly outside of your immediate community and immediate environment. Macro is like society at large. There's a whole deep theory about it. You can Google Bronfenbrenner. Good luck fucking spelling it. But we have a lot of influences. Right. But also what you consume can also really influence your identity. Right. So I'll use myself as an example for a couple of these. One, for one reason or another, learned the importance of emotion regulation at an early-ish age, right? Combination of childhood trauma and then my own cognitive wiring that predisposes me toward impulsivity. So I was like, I have to learn to control this shit. So I had that of like, this is important for me. And then I sought things out that helped me create and reinforce that identity. Right. That's why I like Vulcan shit from Star Trek because they're very logical. They're also super arrogant, which is one of my lesser pleasant personality traits sometimes. But then I also gravitated toward like Ryan Holiday's writing, right? Because he does a lot of Stoic writing. So like Obstacles Away is pretty good. Recommend that. Daily Stoic. This is just like a daily reader. I love Stoicism, right? And then I also love Buddhism. These are just the few books I have in front of me. Thich Nhat Hanh, Miracle of Mindfulness, super good. And I gravitated towards Stoicism and Buddhism because they're very practical and they're frequently about emotion regulation and being more intentional with how you show up. Because I identify as somebody who is more emotionally controlled and who tries to be content in the moment and things like this, right? I try not to be in a rush. And that is also how people tend to describe me, which reinforces that identity, right? So then I seek more things like that because over time, those things just resonate with me on a deeper level because I'm like, this is resonant with who I am and how I identify myself, right? But then there are other things where, like, as you develop, so my own shit. Let me see how I'm going to describe this. So when I was in school, I had some less than savory things occur in childhood, and that combined with like your typical teenage angstiness, because teens are a great thing to study when it comes to identity, right? Because teens are really, really good, at least they were back in my day, of trying on different identities to see which one fits. Right. And when you go to a high school, there are cliques. Well, those cliques are emblematic of an identity, right? Here are your preps, here are your jocks, here's this, here's that. Here are your AP kids, whatever, right?
Every 90s movie opening.
Yes.
Watch it.
Yes. I don't even know what the fuck they are now. My middle school had another group called Freaks. Freaks were basically goths, but goths who fought. Like they weren't the sad goths, they were the angry goths. But they wore all black. They painted their nails. They just would also punch you in the fucking throat. I like the Freaks. They were fun. But there was, so a combination of darkness, we'll say. I tended to gravitate toward darker themed things. And I still do to this day, right? I also identified as like a black sheep because growing up in rural Appalachia, it's hard to not grow up Christian. I do not identify as Christian at all. I don't give a shit if you do. I hard don't, right? I remember being a kid, very, very young. We were in Sunday school and we had to make picture frames out of popsicle sticks. And I remember sitting in Sunday school and thinking to myself, because I was that young that we were making fucking popsicle stick picture frames. I remember thinking, I don't belong here. This isn't for me. This isn't who I am. Everybody around me is telling me this is who I am and who I should be. I should be this Christian. I should be Baptist or whatever the fuck it was. And even from that age, like I had this proclivity of this ain't it for me. And then I specifically sought out counterculture things that helped that. Because then I found other people who had a similar identity, right? And then now it's like a lot of my friends are like Reformed Christians, basically, right? That identity continually got reinforced. I looked for the darker shit. I looked for the goth kids. I looked for the metalheads. I looked for the D&D nerds. I looked for the black sheeps of society because that was how I identified. And largely, I still do. I wore fucking Jinko jeans and shit in middle school. I fucking love Jinko jeans. Like, either you know what Jinko jeans are or you fucking don't. That's the whole thing. But that's part of how identity develops, right? You start with some proclivities, potentially, and then you seek out things. And just because your environment enforces or reinforces one identity doesn't mean that's the identity you will accept. You're not just a product of your upbringing. You are a product of how you respond to your upbringing. Now that everybody knows how fucking weird of a kid I was and still am. Anything else on that for now?
Okay. No, I think your story captured the nature plus nurture thing really well. I think I may have shared this in the Enneagram episode, but I had a really interesting conversation with my parents, even in the last couple of months, around how certain parts of my identities and patterning came as a reaction to them, but some of them, they were just like, you just came out of the womb this way, man. And so I do think it's a very complicated thing that starts from nature the moment you were conceived, and then nurture from the combination of all these forces. And in my experience, the goal, if your goal with your identities is to figure out exactly where they come from, that's actually kind of it's a red herring. That's not the direction we need to go. It can help loosen it to understand that, but it's not like once you understand it, the work is done. So you don't need answering that question. Actually, for me, from a personal transformation standpoint, is not the most important facets of understanding our identities.
I love calling it a red herring because there are whole modalities around like reparenting and like going back to your childhood, and they're all bullshit. 100%. Can't convince me otherwise.
I do still remember the first therapist I ever worked with who just like really wanted to talk about my parents. Like every session. And I was like, they're great. Like, leave me the fuck. This isn't what we're here for, dude. I'm like, this is like, I was like, I got no issues. Listen, this is not why we're here. And like this issue that happened at work is not about that.
Yeah. Again, there can be some juice in it for me once we found the identity and the pattern to go, oh, that's where that came from. And then we can hold it a little more loosely, but it's not like that's going to be the thing that then.
But not everything has to be tied to my parents. Can I own a little bit of myself? You know what I mean? Can I just own a little bit of myself? Thank you.
So there are a couple more things I want to talk through for today. We'll do this order. Spicy takes. And we can always move this to the after dark hours or the after dark portion of the show.
Our OnlyFans account?
Yes, our OnlyFans account. Ricky and I will show you our appendix scars and maybe our feet.
Woo, woo, woo.
And there will be sound excerpts of each of us burping, different qualities of burps.
We have custom ASMR of just mouth, just jowls, just fucking.
It's only Corey's mouth. No one else wanted to participate in that one.
I'm going to answer the question.
Thanks, Justin.
I don't know what the normal takes are, so I don't necessarily know what a spicy take is. I think maybe the spicy take for, again, I said it early for our thing, is there's a lot of focus these days, especially in warning grenade land, of like gender identity and things like this, that the most important thing is that other people are aligned with how, like, what we believe our identities to be. I can see why that's important in certain hostile environments where people are actively in opposition to them. But again, my experience is if I can own and settle into my own identities, I actually don't need the outside world to mirror them back to me. And so I think the most rich point of inner work is to really exploring my identities and owning them and learning to love them, so I don't necessarily need the people outside of me to reinforce them for me.
I think my slight spicy take in this topic is that while useful, they're not the end all be all of like existing in life. Like I think it's okay if someone is listening to this episode and you're like, I don't want to do identity work. Seems like a lot. Like I think it's okay to hold all of this very lightly, which might be in opposition of everything that we've been talking about in this entire episode. But I do sort of, there's this element of like, we should be curious around it. We should investigate it. We should question it. And it is a really useful tool in terms of like habitual transformation, like taking control of sort of what's important to you. But like, if you're doing okay, you're doing okay. I think that was the thing, is that sometimes somewhere through this conversation, it sort of felt like, oh my God, I need to like be spending time with my identity and like thinking about it. But it's like, if you're doing okay, if you got good community, good connections, work's okay, we're good. We're good. This is like a deeper level of work that I think is required in certain times in our lives. But if you're doing cool, you don't got to add this to your grocery list. That's my spicy take.
My spiciest take / most controversial / most likely to get me quote unquote canceled is a growing issue that I keep seeing, and I largely blame TikTok and Instagram. Is everybody's got autism and ADHD now. Here's the thing. You may very well have those things. I don't know you. I'm not going to diagnose you. I can. I'm not going to. But I have increasingly seen just a growing number of people who are like, oh, I'm autistic. I didn't know that. And it's like, one, yes, sometimes that can happen 100%. But when I watch, because some of these things I think they're funny. So like, it's like 2 a.m. and I'm just scrolling Instagram or some shit. And I will see things of like, oh, do you have these symptoms? You must have ADHD or you must have autism. And it's like, one, there's so much nuance as a psychologist around all that. It's like, before this episode, Justin, I made like a bunch of like mouth noises and shit in the microphone. And you were like, that makes my skin crawl, basically. Right. What would happen is TikTok would be like, do random noises irritate you? And like, it burns a hole through your brain. You must have autism. This is a secret symptom of autism. So then you, not knowing fuck all, are like, oh my God, I must be autistic. That makes so much sense. And and that is the degree of absurdity that a lot of these things are. So people are self-diagnosing, or they're talking to Dr. TikTok. Or what I'm also seeing is that trained clinicians somehow are lowering their quality bar for diagnostic criteria. And then they're like, oh, well, sure. Self-reported, you struggle to concentrate on things that don't interest you. You must have ADHD. Here's some fucking Adderall. So, one, that's a huge issue. But then the individual, the person is like, I am ADHD. I am autistic. That is my identity, which has become a crutch and has confined me and who I am, right? You've probably seen these people. You've probably talked to them like, it's like 6 degrees of separation. No matter what the fuck you talk about, they somehow find a way to bring it back to, yeah, I'm ADHD. Or they introduce themselves. I literally saw this the other day. Somebody introduced themselves like, I am ADHD. And I'm like, I am out of this conversation. Because it's not my thing. Okay. You may very well have these things. Statistically, you probably don't, but you may. It's very, very, very valid for some people. Nowhere near as many. Talked to somebody the other day. They're like, I just got diagnosed with ADHD and autism. I'm like, if this was therapy, I would revoke those diagnoses. But you're seeing me for this thing over here, and I'm not in a clinician capacity right now. Okay. It is a growing issue. But the more concerning issue is people are accepting it as their identity, which has become a prison because there's nothing I can do about it. This is everything that I am. Okay. If it helps you, if it is legit and it helps you understand yourself, and you're like, oh, this isn't a character flaw. It isn't that I'm lazy. It isn't that I'm unmotivated. I legitimately want to do things, but due to my wiring, I am predisposed toward impulsivity. I am predisposed toward disorganization. Now I can accept this about myself and learn to find ways around it. That's completely beautiful. But if it's like, oh, I'm ADHD, there's nothing I can do. Like, that's just who I am. You're fucked from the beginning. Okay. Because people see it as a terminal diagnosis with no treatment. Okay. One of the things we learned when I was in grad school is we don't say he is a cup. We say he has a cup. Okay. We do not confuse the person with the thing, right? Psychologists, we use person first language. So we would say you have ADHD, not you are ADHD. We would say you have autism, not you are autism. Okay. And that distinction helps you as the individual separate your identity from a diagnosis or from a description or from something else that isn't who you are intrinsically necessarily. I know that's a spicy take, and I accept that.
Yeah, maybe my spicy take is the true long-term developmental objective. Now, this is getting post-teens and things, because I think there's a developmental phase where you are looking for what your identities are. Identification is the healthy expression. But I'm assuming most of our audience here is older, is honestly living in a land beyond the identities. It is being able to operate in the space between identities, be fluid, allow for like authentic flow and aliveness to come out that's not hindered by identities. I think, honestly, I think and this is probably telling you more about me than anything, the people I most aspire to and look up to as role models are people who, you know, the way I've had it said to me is you can't escape identification. You can't escape identities. They're going to be there. But it's people who more often than not are just operating from authentic flow. And when they notice an identity has them, they pause, they work with themselves such that they can, again, operate from just authentic flow. And sometimes that expression may come through an identity, but they are choosing that because that's authentic. They are not stuck in it and going, I am this and I always live inside of this.
Agreed. Next piece is, how do we cultivate identities that empower us rather than enslave us? Because we talked about what they are, where they come from, the problems, spiciness, all this other shit. Okay, but what the fuck now? Like, how do we actually create ones that help us more than hold us back?
So we're in our practical, tactical section here. Yeah. I got a bunch of stuff. I was taking a bunch of notes during it. I think the first step is you actually need to see the identities that you have now. So like cultivating new ones, the reason why you don't already have those is you have pre-existing ones that are in opposition to that. And so if you really want to understand your identities, just take out a sheet of paper. At the top, write, I am. And then fill up the sheet of paper with every way that you finish that sentence. And there you go. Boom. Here are the things that you identify with. The other side of this that you can do is you can go, I am not, or I don't want to be. And there are your anti-identities, and they probably will correspond to all the things you just wrote I am to, but be an opposite. And if not, you have another I am statement there to work with. And like the way I think of this is like what empowers. Corey, you said that empower us instead of enslave us. What I think of is how can we create more choice? How can we empower more fluidity, undergo identity evolution or changes? Once you have that list, look at the things that feel like they are they're contributing the most to your suffering. They're contributing the most to your stuckness. They're contributing the most to what you feel enslaves you. And then get really honest. Like pick the biggest one and go, what do I really get from this? Like first, what are the payoffs? And here's the thing of identity. Imagine your identities as people and think of how easy is it to cooperate with a person. Here's an axiom I have is your identities won't go away. So you can't just kill them. So assume you can't just kill this person. You have to collaborate with them. How well is it going to go if it's going to go, you're such a problem, fuck off, get out of here. Versus having like a, hey, I really see what this identity does for me. God, I appreciate this part of me for doing it. So one, actually have some self-acceptance and some appreciation for what the identity does create for you. You have, in my experience, you have to go through this for authentic transformation. You have to appreciate it. Otherwise, it's just going to dig its toes in harder. And then really face all of the costs. And this is the hard part because unconsciously we don't want to face the costs. We don't want to face how we're creating the things that we don't want. But in my experiences, if I can authentically honor and appreciate the way the identity has served me, while on the same hand holding all of the things that costs me, usually there's a point where awareness will build and feelings will come up where, boom, transformation actually spontaneously happens. We just go, oh, I'm done with this. I'm going to try it a different way.
The two other practices I found really helpful are one, have practices that take you out of identities altogether. Again, for me, that's plant medicine. For some people, that's exercise can get them into these states. For some people, that's meditation. For some people, that's this non-sleep deep rest, NSDR. But get into the practice of living in the place where you're not identified at all. The most potent thing I found is sitting down to meditate, but having the meditation literally just be, I'm not trying to fight my thoughts or anything. I'm just identifying with the physical sensations of my body. I am purely paying attention to sensation, just what's here. And slowly kind of identity fades away from me. And the last thing, this is something we did in the conscious leadership group that was one of the most transformative things that I've ever done is we would do these things called persona parties. And the idea was find an anti-identity. Find an identity that you reject, that you go, I do not want to be this way. For the first one we did, I made mine creepy. And what I realized was the essence of creepiness was I don't pay attention to what you think of me at all. I don't care. I totally don't read the signals. And we would do these persona parties where everyone would show up as an identity that they rejected. And you would get the experience of stress testing. What's it actually like when I am this way out in reality? And the story started to fade away. I found it just being totally willing to be, quote unquote, creepy or weird. It was so free. It just didn't matter what the other person threw back to me. And so those are the things where put together in my experience are the most deeply transformational. Now they're easier said than done, but just start with getting the list and then pick one where you go, this one's kind of causing me some trouble.
I think I'm on board with everything Justin's saying. Listen, I think when it comes to identity work, I think the only things I'd add is when you have that big list, going back to that question, who told you that, right? Let's start to recognize, where did that identity come from? And is it a source that we want to be a source of truth? Is that something that we want to continue to honor and uphold? Or is it something that we want to work with? How does it help you? How does it serve you? How does it hurt you? And how does it hold you back? So you're starting to have a lot of curiosity around the components of your identity. And then the second, so it's really just this is a sit down and think exercise.
Think and feel, in my experience.
Think and feel. That's
feel
a nice
everything
addition.
that comes up as you appreciate it and as you face what it doesn't cost. The feeling is what causes the embodied transformation, not just up in the head.
And then the second thing that I have done with folks is around trying on an identity. It's similar to your persona party, but less about choosing one that's an anti-identity, but actually one that you do want. So I had a fantastic client, incredibly talented, beautiful background, who really wanted to be a leader, wanted to be seen as a leader. And they were struggling with it because they were saying, I'm just not a leader. I just don't have leadership qualities. So after some work around, what does that mean? What does that look like? They ultimately chose a week and specific meetings. And every single meeting they showed up and went into it as, I am a leader. And how did the meeting shift? How did they shift as they went into that meeting? And full disclosure, a couple months later, they have direct reports. They shifted into a leadership title. And so I think that there's benefit, especially if you can identify something that you want to try and then just really tell yourself, I am going to go do this thing and I'm going to just embody it. And this is not fake it till you make it. This is actually around, I'm trying on an identity. I'm seeing how it feels. And I think that if for that individual, she had gone into those meetings and felt really uncomfortable, really out of whack, it would have given us information around other skills that she needed to develop. But in fact, what it showed her was, I already am a fucking leader. I just wasn't using the language. I already can show up in this identity. So I think those are the two things, which is really around being curious around the identities that you've listed in Justin's great example in work, and also trying them on. If there's an identity that you want, try it on. Just pick a week, pick a meeting, pick an event, and say, I am this thing, right? And then just see how it feels and how you experience it. It can be wildly enjoyable, is what that individual learned. Something that was really scary and seemed impossible. Afterwards, she was like, the meetings just went really well. Like they were just so smooth. I prepared slightly differently. People listened in a different way, and they can be really fun to try it on.
One super tactical tip for that is if you're playing with one that feels edgy for you, like being, I'm going to be a leader maybe feels less edgy than I'm going to be direct. I'm going to let myself be mean, what I think is mean. It can be helpful to just let people know that you're running the experiment. Like people scare themselves with it and just say, hey, I'm just planning on being more direct, like risking being a little mean. Let me know if it crosses any boundaries for you. So if you're playing with edgy ones, it can just be helpful to like let people know, let them know you're experimenting with a different way of being and relating.
Yeah, especially like with your partner. If you're going to start doing some stuff with your partner, you might want to give them a heads up.
Always. Don't spring anything on them.
No surprises.
For
Go
me,
ahead, Corey.
one thing is you can't change the event, but you can change the story of the event and what the event means. So, for example, I talked before about somebody I worked with and they identified as a victim. Again, this is therapy shit, but what we did over time was we learned this bad thing, this thing that you're labeling as bad happened to you. And you came out of that identifying as a victim. But another version of that is you came out of that as a survivor. And that was a large shift we made over, weeks and months of sessions, is learning to shift the identity from victim to survivor. Nothing else changed, right? You can't time travel. You can't go back in time and like change what actually objectively happened, but you can change subjectively how you experience it and what you take away from it, right? There's this thing in psychology called traumatic growth. My version is you learn to turn shit into fertilizer and grow from it, right? Like some fucked up shit happened and you can either let that stall you out in life, or you can say, okay, what positives or wisdom can I take from this to then grow from after the fact? Okay. Easier said than done, but definitely worth giving a try. So changing your story and basically saying like, what identity do I want to have? What identity would help me progress and grow from this point onward? How can I start trying that identity on? What internal work do I need to do to slowly accept that new identity? That's really powerful work. Another thing is develop not multiple identities, because that's a whole separate issue, but a multi-dimensional identity. Okay. So for example, maybe you identify as a founder, but maybe you also identify as a parent or as an athlete or as a writer, as this, as that. This multidimensionality gives you a more robust, holistic, healthy, adaptable way to see yourself and how you show up in the world. It's also much more resilient if one of those things goes by the wayside. Okay, because now you have the other parts of yourself to quote unquote fall back on and continue forward. Okay. I also am a huge fan, I brought this up a little bit ago, of person first language. Okay. I'm not overly politically correct by far, but I do like the concept of person first language. Okay. And rather than using your identity to define you, think of it as describing you. So for example, if you currently identify as a people pleaser, that defines you. I am a people pleaser, versus switching it to a description of I have a tendency to people please, or I am an anxious person, versus I tend to get anxious quickly. Okay. Or I am prone to getting anxious or to experiencing anxiety. That is very different. It seems like a subtle thing, and it is at first, but if you can just start to separate yourself from this thing, it allows you to be like, oh, I have a cup. I am not a cup. I have this. I have a tendency toward this, but this does not define who I am. Because if you identify as I am anxious or I am an anxious person than when I say, oh, have you tried mindfulness? Have you tried meditation? Oh, I'm an anxious person. That doesn't work. Right? Versus if you say, I have a propensity toward anxiety. And I say, oh, have you tried mindfulness? You're like, it's really difficult for me. Okay, cool. That means it's a skill you suck at. Therefore, therefore you have a skill deficit. Any skill deficit you can improve by practicing. So it isn't that you're just an anxious person so much as you suck at emotion regulation. You suck at cognitive restructuring. You suck at, calming yourself down through other methods. Therefore, you have just identified what you need to do to address that. And then over time, then maybe you see yourself, you identify as something else. Okay. That can be really, really powerful.
Just at one point, Corey, on that language point, when we do talk about like parts and persona work in IFS, this is part of the reason why we do that is because you separate it as not you, but a part of you. And frequently the language we would use is like, hey, oh, I noticed my anxious one is here, or my inner critic is here. Or like for me, there was a while there where I would just point out every time my catastrophizer is here, assuming the worst is going to happen. It's the same thing. And like you said, it's small at first, but it actually becomes big the more and more you can separate yourself from it.
Yes. Seth Godin has this really good thing of people like us do things like this. Now he's talking about marketing and like niching and all of this shit, but he's inherently talking about identity. People like us do things like this. I said before, I don't drink. I don't identify as sober because sober tends to connotate like sobriety, like recovery. And I never got to the point of addiction. I'm straight up not a drinker. I'm not straight edge because I do caffeine, but like whatever is straight edge light, like all I do is caffeine. I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't fuck off with drugs, never smoked weed, never done pills and shit. That's just not who I am. My identity, that's not who I am. Right. So when if I go to a party and someone's like, hey, Corey, do you want to drink? I feel zero pressure to say yes, because that isn't my identity. Right. A lot of people who don't have that identity, they're like, oh, I don't really want to drink, but okay, you offered it. Oh, I feel like I'm supposed to drink in the situation. It's like, motherfucker, that isn't who I am. I have no problem saying this isn't who I am. So you can find identities that help you of like, if you want to identify as sober or as a non-drinker or as whatever, as soon as you accept that as an identity, you can then leverage what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. All cognitive dissonance is basically stress or discomfort we feel when our beliefs and our behaviors contradict each other. So if I identify as sober, but then I accept a drink, I have now created cognitive dissonance because how I identify and how I'm showing up in the world don't align anymore. So I have to either change how I think or how I act. And it's up to you as far as which one you choose. But that is one way you can do it of like, I don't want to do this anymore. Cool. Then identify as someone who doesn't do that anymore. And then you can start to leverage that cognitive dissonance that will kick in of like, hey, people like you don't do things like this. Oh, that's right. I don't do this. Right. That can be super helpful. And then the one other thing I'll say is you don't have to accept the label someone else tries to give you. Like you just straight up fucking don't. Like people will always try to put you in a box. People, and sometimes it is passive. Sometimes it is legitimately aggressive, especially just like we talk about like with trans shit, like that there are like legitimately hostile environments where it's just like, it isn't just like, I'm cool with who I am. It's like, you are actively aggressing me in this situation. You're following me in the bathroom. You're like, of course, that is completely different shit, right? People will try to put you in a box, typically passively without hostility in mind. It's just we as humans, we have to categorize things. We operate off of heuristics, off of schemas, off of mental models of how the world works. So people will inevitably say, oh, you're this. And you get to decide, am I this? Do I want to be this? Do I want to accept this as who I am or as a part of who I am? You do not have to. You are under no obligation to accept someone else's definition or label of you. And when you learn that, you can then start to be more intentional with how you define yourself and how you label and identify yourself. And even if you've been carrying around a toxic identity from childhood or from whatever the fuck, today, right the fuck now, you can say, that isn't who I am. Now let me do the things I need to do that will reinforce this new identity so that it doesn't feel awkward anymore. But that is 100% doable, regardless of what the fuck you've been through and what identities you have historically had. That's my soapbox on that. I know we're going long, so we'll wrap it up. Anything else to wrap up today's episode on identity that you all think is worth throwing out there?
In my experience, one, like Ricky said, you don't have to change identities, but it is one of the deeper things that you can do if you really want to do personal transformation. My experience is real transformation, not just reframes and things, comes at the root of identity. And like we said, I think really there are two ways to attack it, which one is try on a new identity that you haven't before, which I think that sometimes works. The most powerful intervention for me, though, is really understand the one that you have now and appreciate it and work on shifting it and making space for a new way of being to emerge. What I wouldn't try and do is just try and steamroll over the current identity. That usually doesn't work very well, in my opinion. So really like understanding the pros and the cons and the trade-offs and feeling all the feelings that come up around it, in my experience, is where real long-term embodied personal transformation comes from.
I think the thing I would add is that similar to all the memes about how, oh, when you start working out in the first like week, you feel it, but nobody else notices for 6 weeks or whatever the fucking thing is recognizing that this type of work, it's actually going to be around you first. It's going to be around you working through that before it's actually starting to be perceived. And so recognizing that, I think, is really important. When you're doing that kind of deep transformational work, you're going to want everybody, oh, don't you see me? Don't you see me? See who I am now? They don't yet. And also, truthfully, it doesn't fucking matter. But at the end of the day, recognizing that it's a long, slow process often, I think, is helpful too.
The only other thing I'll add is learning to be aware of your expectations of your identity and recognizing that it takes time to sink in. So, for example, I wrote for years before I identified as a writer. And the same thing with like an entrepreneur. Like I had a business for a while before I identified as an entrepreneur because because of my expectations of like, oh, I'm not a real quote unquote writer. I'm not a real entrepreneur, because my expectation of, if in order to be a writer, you have to be a traditionally published author. Or in order to be a real entrepreneur, you have to have X amount in revenue or whatever, right? So learning to keep that into context and really look at what are my expectations of this identity that I want to have, but I currently feel unworthy of that identity. Because if you feel unworthy of your identity, that's imposter syndrome. That's a bunch of other shit that kicks in, right? So learning to set your expectations and recognize it'll take time to sink in. But if you keep doing things that reinforce that empowering identity over time, it does typically sink in. That's all I got.
All right, friends, this is a long one. Will be a long one. Thanks. Hope you got lots of juicy tidbits on identity. Like, rate, subscribe, do all the things that let the world know how much you love us, because you do.
Share it with a friend.
Share with a friend.
Share with a friend.
And then we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Corey, take us out.
Toodles.